Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, SEC588, Cloud Penetration Testing. What is it, what's different, and why? My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Moses Frost, SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Moses.
Thank you, Carol. And good afternoon for those in the US. It's a cold day. I guess winter is starting to be here. So first of all, for those that didn't know, did you know that we're launching a cloud penetration class with tons of technologies in the class that you may have not touched before? It's going to be fully cloud delivered, live fire. And we're doing this to try to help fill a giant gap in the field. So my name is Moses Frost, and this is a soft introduction to a class that I've spent the last year or so building. And I'm super excited to give you a taste of what it is. And hopefully, for those that have never seen some of the cloud technologies before, we're going to give you some idea for what the class is. So I'd like to thank everybody that took time off from their busy schedules. I know that time is a commodity that nobody has. And so just spending a little bit with me is a huge thing. So I appreciate it. Since we're going to spend about an hour or so, and by the way, feel free to ask any questions you want in the Q&A field in the chat window on the side. I'll be sure to answer them as we go. Just because we're going to spend some time together, I always feel like it's fun to at least describe who you're hearing or who you're talking to. But you know, the common stuff that people put on slides, it's so general. I thought I'd make this one a little bit more fun. So Moses Frost, if you Google search me, you'll see that it was Moses Hernandez at one point. That's a whole conversation we can have at some point. See, fun facts. I thought fun facts would be more interesting than just typical work experience. So I had been using Linux, and I was looking the other day at the date. So I was using Linux since I was about 15 or 16 years old. Linux kernel 1.2. So that'll date me a little bit here. I ran a couple bulletin boards in the 90s because I was a weird 12, 13-year-old teenager. And like many people that might be seeing this for the first time, you know, I started out as a SANS student. And I remember the first class that I took, probably like many others, was the 504 class. And just to kind of give you an idea for nobody is perfect in this world. Nobody comes out of the gate being a rock star or excellent or whatever you may have a perception of people. I think I won the CTF, not won one, but I finished the CTF, I should say, by using the Windows XP TFTP client, which actually is kind of sad, probably because I didn't fully understand how all the netcat stuff worked at the time. And I got stuck for a long time trying to get scheduled tasks running because I couldn't figure out how net time worked on a foreign system. So it's the little things in life, isn't it? And let's see what else. Oh, and of course, the ultimate hacker tool. If you've ever taken any one of my classes, I will tell you that the ultimate best hacker tool that you can ever have in your tool belt is the clipboard with copy and paste, or as some of the little, you know, some of the dev kids might call it, copy pasta. So there you go. Just giving you some fun little facts so that we can share and share alike. And by the way, if you have any fun things that you might want to chat in the chat window or send to me, just because there might be little tidbits of hilarity in it, you can always do that as well, because I like to collect those. It's always fun to see that we're all human, and you know, um, we all have our little war stories here and there.
Moses, in order for you to see them in the questions window, I'll assign them to your name so you can expand that questions
Yeah.
window and see any
Perfect. Yeah.
comments there. Okay.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. Awesome. There you go. See, I'm getting a few already. All right. So um, let's see. So first of all, the SANS promise. Um, one of the things at SANS that I was really happy when I first started taking the classes years ago is that the promise was, and the promise still is, that whatever you learn in class, you will be immediately able to take back to your office and work, heck, that same day, right? And I've kept that in mind as I've been writing this class. What is it that we as practitioners, and I don't care if you're on the red team, blue team, doesn't matter. We as practitioners, we need to be able to go back and instantly solve problems. And so as you look at the landscape today, and I took this quote out of a Forbes article from about a year or two ago where they did a survey. And I actually put this in class because I think it's a very compelling article. It basically says that companies are adopting more and more cloud every year, with about 70% at the time of companies having some type of cloud. And we can argue the semantics of the survey and whether they would consider things like Office 365 or Google Documents cloud, but some kind of cloud-based technology. About 70% of companies adopting it, and the number of folks having cloud technologies expanding. And it's not a joke to say that many of the verticals that you would not imagine adopting cloud are adopting some form of cloud, maybe not for their most sensitive internal things right away, but when it comes to things like telecommunications, right, with their 5G rollouts, and the fact that they're probably looking at containers or microservices or something like that to be able to deliver them. Or when you look at things like manufacturing or some kind of tech space, right, where you are seeing them adopt clouds, even if it's just for a development environment and maybe not production or whatever it is, we are seeing people trying to move workloads almost exclusively into the cloud. And so as we do that, we have to understand what the nuances are of testing these environments so that we know that we're building them to withstand actual attack. So if you look at the SANS penetration courses today, you will see that we've got general training such as SEC560, which is one of the ones that are near and dear in my heart, and 542. Just to give you an idea, I think my GPEN number is like 12 or 13, and my GWAP number is like 14 or 15. I do remember taking these classes early on, and they are just such good classes. They're so core and so essential to what we do every day. And then we have the specialized training, which takes these classes and expands on them. So if you want to know more about web, I help author 642 along with Adrian DeBerb, that he's a great instructor. You've got things like 660 and 760, which are 700 level classes. They're amazing classes. You have ranges and you have wireless. You have classes on how to use Python and how to automate security with Python, right? And this is just a subset of all the classes that SANS has today. But what you don't see, and what you're getting an idea for, is that we don't have any classes right now that are dedicated to testing the security of cloud infrastructures and cloud-based technologies today. We have cloud classes, right? We have cloud classes that talk about how to harden the cloud, how to build secure cloud, but we don't have a class on how to test the security of these cloud deployments. And so this is why we decided to go out and start building a class that takes a look at clouds and how we can assess whether or not our cloud deployments are secured. So who's this class for? Well, it's obvious that we would target a class for people who are already doing penetration testing, right? But I can, as every other SANS pen testing course that I've seen, I've had people that do bug bounties in class. I've had people that do consultants in my classes. I've had cloud architects, site reliability engineers, blue team forensics people. We have managers. I've even had legal people come take penetration testing classes, believe it or not. Procurement folks, if you're procuring. The cloud class is intended for anybody that is touching a cloud technology and has to do work in these cloud environments. The topics that we talk about are relevant to public utility clouds, and we talk a lot about where exactly the adversaries are looking to target these environments and how they're abusing the ways that your infrastructures may be implemented. We also talk about things like demarcations and exactly what you can test. We spend a fair bit of time on terms of service, on what's allowable, on what the cloud providers will let you test, what is out of bounds, how to make sure that when you are doing things, you are not even breaking laws, right? That's a very important thing when you try to do these cloud assessments, what you can do and what you can't do. And we also spend a fair bit of time of how these things are broken and how we can fix them, right? Because that's important. It's not just important to understand where the breaking points are, but it's also important to understand how to recommend and suggest fixes for some of these things. Now, cloud, and this is the big concern that most people have, right? Can I go take a cloud pen testing class and is it have overlap? Is it going to confuse me? Do I have to be a developer? Who is this class intended for? It sounds like there's going to be a lot of things in here that might not be in my wheelhouse or may not be something that I am comfortable with, right? So the first thing I want to say is that cloud is not just a take what you have on premise and shift it off premise, right? But it's also not just an infrastructure play. It's not just about containers. It's not only for developers, right? Cloud is a mechanism for you to provision infrastructure and services in a very efficient and fast way. And it has a lot of unique properties that you may have not taken into consideration when moving into the cloud. So should I be scared that I won't be able to, say, handle a course like this, right? Do I have to be a developer, or what do I need to do this? Is this something that I may be even interested in? So the good news is that just like that old Unix saying, okay, it's all the same, just a little bit different, okay? Cloud does feature some similarities with what we're doing on premise, and there's not that much coding that is involved in it. Now, I'm not gonna lie, we're gonna see some scripts, but you're gonna see some scripts when you do exploitation and some of the other classes as well. So I do believe that there is a fair bit of work or a fair bit of things you're gonna get out of it, and it's going to be something that that you can definitely put your arms around, right? So let's talk about this. First of all, is there overlap between cloud and web? And the actual truth is there is overlap between both technologies, as you could imagine, but the amount of overlap between the classes is actually fairly small. The methodologies may feel similar, kind of similar, but the actual tools that you use and what you do in the class are fairly different, right? And I kind of wanted to paint that picture for you. Like, what does that mean? What does it mean for it to be a different technology than what I'm used to? So for anybody that's taken 560, and quite a fair number of people at SANS have, 560 focuses on things like internal and external network assessments through things like scanning over, say, Nmap, or maybe now in the latest build, if anybody's taken the latest version of 560, they start introducing things like Nmap and mass-scan. But the idea behind that is to try to get as accurate of a scan while being as efficient as possible. I wouldn't say sacrificing accuracy over speed, but I do think that you would probably err on accuracy and come down on the speed in order to understand that you don't miss anything in the 560 course. In the cloud course, well, we've got a couple of things going on. Number one, we may be dealing with the internet, right? So if we are doing any kind of scans, the scans are by and large fairly long, fairly broad scoped, all right? So we talk about things like mass scan, where we actually do sacrifice some accuracy for speed. But we also talk about, well, if you are using a cloud service provider and you have tokens and you have some of the capability, that you're doing internal reconnaissance through the cloud infrastructure APIs. So you might not actually be doing a network scan as much as you might be doing a listing of resources or a listing of objects inside of a service provider. Just a different way of doing reconnaissance, but accomplishing the same goals, right? Or we might be looking at protocols such as NTLM, SSH, Landman and Kerberos, HTTP or SMB, right? This is a focus of 560 because you're dealing with on-premise, traditional, I wouldn't even say legacy, I would say traditional or classic technologies, which are still in use today, right? On your LAN, you're going to have LAN protocols. It's just the way that they work. But in the cloud, well, those protocols are not actually going to be as relevant. Now, there was an initial version of, say, Azure Files that could do SMB, but by far and large, the actual common protocols in the cloud end up being things like HTTP, even for file shares, gRPC. Oh, and actually, at the type of that, should be gRPC. Sorry about that. The Google RPC server that is used to control things like Kubernetes, right? There's OAuth and SAML as authentication protocols versus, say, Landman and NTLM with Azure AD. And so the protocols change. Does that mean that our approach or our methodology to try to break into these networks change all that much? No, the tools might change. The methodology actually doesn't change. And we're just trying to show you that there is a similar methodology with a new tool chain, right? You do pivots quite often in the network pen test world. They're fantastic, like netcat, and use passwords and grab hashes out of memory and abuse the architecture of the network to try to get further and further into a network. Can we do that in the cloud? Well, we could get Mimikatz, put it on a Windows server in the cloud and obtain hashes that way. And you might be able to go from system to system that way. And that seems to be a common thing that I see. However, more effective way of doing this is to not have just hashes out of Mimikatz, but to have API tokens and bearer tokens and keys and SSH keys and certificates, and to use either the Kubernetes API or the Azure API or the Amazon Web Services CLI, and actually do your pivots that way. So you're pivoting not within the systems, right? So don't think of it as pivoting within two servers, but instead you're pivoting from one part of the cloud service provider outside, introspecting that provider from the outside and starting to move laterally, not from within the OS, but from outside the OS. It's just a different way of thinking through lateral movements. So it's still Prevesc, it's still lateral movements, but it's just not the way that you originally thought about it. And it's totally available, right? As long as you have the right access and the right keys, and we'll show you how to get that. And then, of course, post-exploitation pivots past the hash. It's very similar, right? Instead of that, we're talking about taking tokens and moving them around, right? So that's an example of the contrast between 560 and 588. It doesn't mean that one is necessarily going to yield you a better outcome in your professional life than the other. It just means that these are technologies that are complementary, that if you are on a pen test and you are given a network internal pen test and a cloud component, that you're able to put your hands around both and say, I can give you a better test because I know how to use these technologies together, right? Now, the big question, right? Web, because obviously, if we're dealing with Amazon Web Services and we're dealing with, say, a web application pen tester, surely must be a large amount of overlap in between those classes because, you know, they have web. It says web in there. It must be web. And in reality, there's not, right? So in the web app pen testing classes, which I'm an instructor at 542, I author 642, there is a lot of focus on the web stack, right? Whether it's cross-site scripting or SQL injection, it's an application-focused class where we're dealing a lot with how the applications are laid out in a classical sense, right? And these applications, no matter how much cloud you have, are going to be around for a fair amount of time. I'll give you an example. It's an anecdotal example that many of you may or may not relate to. But today, you all probably go and you take out money from your ATM. And when you go and transact on that ATM network, whether it's through the debit card network or it's the network that moves money around, your online bill paying or whatever, much of that network is still running on COBOL, right? And it's still being developed on COBOL. That network is so important and so fundamentally core to the financial system that it will probably be running that application stack for a long time, which means it has to be tested, it has to be upgraded, it has to be maintained. Similarly, the web applications that you see today are not all going to get rewritten. And the focus of a web application penetration class is not going to fundamentally change to try to remove that focus, because we still need to be able to test these applications that are fundamentally core to our application stack. In the cloud test world, where we deal with web applications is we discuss how a web application in the cloud might be containerized and how it may be delivered as a microservice instead of something like a CI/CD pipeline, and how you can assess that microservice architecture, right? So we talk about serverless functions as a service. We talk about microservices and Kubernetes environment. This is what we're doing in the cloud class, right? Authentications, huge part of the web app pen testing class paradigm. Authentications as they relate to the web applications, forms-based and all that. In the cloud world, we talk about authorizations, right? We spend a fair bit of time on authorizations and scope and how we can abuse permissions to do privilege escalation with authorizations. It's a little different because we're not just looking at how to do username harvesting or how we can start to do password attacks. We don't spend much time on that at all. Instead, what we spend time on is things like IAM and SAML and how SAML plays a role with API keys and how to find undocumented APIs. It's just a different way of looking at a web application. In the pen testing classes for the web, we do things like application level attacks. So if you think about 542, we talk about CSRF, and we do cross-site scripting, and we do SQL injection. In 642, we talk about things like template injection and object deserializations, right? We don't actually do that in the cloud one, right? We think about things like how the proxies are laid in and desync attacks. We talk about some SSRFs because those are kind of critical to avoid in the cloud pen testing world and why they're critical to avoid. What could happen if you introduce an SSRF to your application, such as like the Capital One breach, right? Where having the SSRF in the application actually was a very pivotal thing that allowed for additional attacks, right? Things like that. We dedicate 5-6 days to web app pen testing, and actually if you count 642 is in there as well, 10 days to pen testing on the web, which is a huge amount of time to dedicate. And we dedicate a day or so in the cloud pen testing class, right? So it's definitely not designed to come anywhere near the focused web pen testing course. It is designed to help you see what a web application is doing as a critical junction point inside of a cloud environment. That's the big contrast there between them. So you might use burp and zap and SQL map in the web pen testing world because that makes sense, right? I mean, these are the tools du jour to actually doing your pen test. But for us in the cloud world, in the cloud pen testing class, we're going to focus on Postman for APIs because APIs are a huge part of cloud. We spend some time with curl and how to use curl. We spend some time with CLI tools. Both classes are going to use web technologies heavily, right? They just have to because of the way that they're built, but doesn't mean that they are actually intended to accomplish the same thing. We're looking at two very, very different things in the classes. And I hope that helps you make a decision as to which one you want to go to. And by the way, you know, as one of the authors for 642, I have a love for that class. It's one of my favorite classes to actually author and teach. But definitely do see a big difference between them, and just want to make sure that was put out there. So I see some questions. Let me see if there's any so far that before I move on to the next section. And actually, let me just see if I can see here. I see. I'm not going to answer that one. All right, cool. So excellent. So by the way, if there's any questions that you did want me to answer, I'd be happy to do it. And I think, actually, I don't know. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, so let's talk about the syllabus. So what are we covering in this class, right? So I want to put in here the syllabus because I haven't shared this publicly with anybody, but just to give you an idea for what we're doing. Now, one of the things that I want to do was I want to have a very, very lab-heavy class, right? Because many of the folks that I've seen, I've talked to in the industry, they don't have much stick time with cloud technologies, right? They may have played with it, they may have played with some AWS, but they don't have focused time in automation and how to quickly put things out there and the like. So I tried to have about 6, maybe a little bit more labs a day. So day 1 is actually a fun day. It's like a treasure hunt day, and I've tried to build the class out to be a treasure hunt. So I'll give you a high-level overview of the first day. The first day, you're given a VM with a wiki, but the wiki is incomplete. And so what we're doing is every lab, we're giving you extra pieces of authentication tokens, and we're actually telling you how to discover the environment that we're giving you, how to find the hosts in the environment using the host discovery tools, how to see what's going on in the environments using things like Eyewitness, how to find artifacts in Git repositories, how to look at and find exposed databases and how to interact with them and what that happens and expose ports and just mapping at scale, reconnaissance at scale. That's the first day. The second day, we deal with things like mapping an application and using the CLI tools. So we rely heavily on CLI tools and showing you how to start taking mapping to the next level. We also talk about tokens, and if you've never played with SAML or OAuth and how the scopes work and how OAuth works and OAuth 2, we play with that. We show you how that could affect an application if you actually start to remove OAuth and how we could take and start doing things like Amazon IAM and identity management and how the identities in Amazon and the roles play. So if you want to know how to go from a non-administrative user and work your way into different services and how you can actually start to manipulate Amazon to give yourself some lateral movements and actually start exploiting it, we show you how to do that with tools. Then we have a day on day 3 that focuses on Azure. So most of the labs in the rest of the class focus heavily on Amazon Web Services. Why? Well, because it's one of the biggest ones out there, right? And I didn't want to give everybody like 4 and 5 cloud applications to work with. So we have a whole class. They focus on Azure and the specific things that Azure has that's unique, right? And how Azure roles work, how their version of IAM and roles interact with each other, how you can get things like Azure AD to work, scope in there, applications, keys. We talk about things like, and just wrote a module on this the other day on Microsoft Graph, right? Microsoft Graph, it's an entire software API that Microsoft has created, which is a wonderful thing, by the way, for Blue Team. It's amazing. It's a whole API that is used for things like Office 365. Well, if an attacker ever got their hands on an Amazon Graph API key, the attacker can start listing things out like file shares, emails, documents, SharePoint, through a well-defined and well-structured API. What probably would be a good idea for you to see how that's abused. So have some Azure Graph in there. Day 4, we deal with cloud native. So this is the day that we deal with the web app part, right? So we talk about cloud native applications, service meshes, pivoting through containers, how containers work, how microservices work, things like that. And then day 5 is basically our exploitation and red teaming day, where we talk about, okay, you've got access to a container, you have access to an environment. How do you take that access and do something with it? How do you actually do the red teaming part, which is actually attacking the defenders? Or how do you do the actual exploitation part? And where are the issues that you might run into, right? What happens when you don't have all of your system tools available to you? Just like many of the pen test classes, at day 6, we wipe everything away and we give you a brand new environment, and it's your capstone day, where you go end to end on a pen test and we guide you along the way, right? And you get to do all of it all together, all in one day. And it's designed to show you how an end-to-end cloud pen test works, right? That's the idea. Super exciting, super fun. It's amazing to see how you can play with things like Lambda and everything else. And it's just, we had a blast doing this. And I think you're gonna have a blast just taking the class, right? So with that said, hopefully you want to get a taste for the class. So I want to give you a taste. Now, I'm not going to do a demo. I'm not going to do a lab, okay? But I will walk you through some slides on the class. Okay, so just to give you an idea for what one of the day, I think it's like a day one slide. So just to give you an idea how deep the rabbit hole goes. So by the it's a day two slide, sorry. So by the way, this is an example of the roadmap for day two. This is actually the roadmap class for day two. Anybody that's ever taken a SANS pen testing course knows this index page very well. So let me show you an example of what we do that's different that you might like. So in this section, and I just cherry picked a couple of slides here. In this section, we talk about how to map infrastructures correctly. And one of the things that I'm very focused on in this class, because it is extremely important to understand very well, is that a good, well-defined, and large enough word list is critical to doing large-scale enumeration. Okay, it's critical, all right? Now, if you have a good enough word list, and we talk about how to generate one in a minute, we might be able to uncover what some people call undocumented, hidden, or unreferenced objects or assets or resources in these environments. Maybe they were incorrectly pushed dynamically into the cloud or into a cloud resource and are left exposed just because of a permissions error, an oversight. You don't know, right? Now, one of the ways to do this, and one of the things I've seen people do, is they will take something like an S3 bucket list and they will scrape and they will scan Amazon for every single S3 bucket that they have found that is exposed, looking for artifacts of sensitive information, right? So basically gather everything up front and then sort out the noise later. It's an option for mapping. Upside is you get to find all the unsecured resources out there. Downside is you might be getting data that you're not allowed to see, or worse, you can violate privacy, right? Something else, you can go to jail, something like that, right? So it's got to be careful. So instead, we try to focus on structured word lists with application mapping. Now, infrastructure mapping, where we look for S3 buckets, while interesting, they focus on the infrastructure as a service provider itself. Application mapping, where a developer has actually put an application out there, feels the same, feels very similar, right? You take a big word list, you throw it maybe in the same tool chain that you use for an application, or sorry, for an infrastructure level assessment. But in this regard, with an application, you're brute forcing in a slightly different way. So you're walking an application and manipulating your requests to try to get the application to reveal something that it did not normally have, right? So it's a little bit of a different methodology. It feels kind of similar, but it's not quite the same. So what do we do? Well, one of the things we could do is we could brute force endpoint URIs, which we're going to talk about in a minute. You can mutate the request. So instead of saying, I want the HTML page of the application, you could say, I want the XML page, or I want the API page. Well, why would you want to do that? Well, if you mutate an application and you go from HTML to XML or API, you might find that the request is treated in a different way. Sometimes it's treated where it's not even authenticated. So what was a authenticated and restricted HTML page ends up being an unrestricted and unauthenticated JavaScript JSON-based page. Right? Depends. Or you could try to work your way through brute forcing everything to where if they intended to only do GET, and it's documented that they only do GET, well, maybe you find that they also support post and push, patch and put and other API calls that, while not disclosed, are there, right? And a word list helps us figure this out quickly, right? That's the idea. Now, because we're going to talk about this in a way that might be kind of foreign to you, one of the things that we just spent a few minutes on is URLs and URIs. So URLs and URIs, commonly, by the way, misunderstood what a URL is and what a URI is. We talk about it. I give you this much. I give you an inch of this right now because they're very heavily covered in 542 and 642. But because we are dealing with URNs, URLs, and URIs inside of our request for the infrastructure, I have to at least introduce you to the concept. So here is a literal, we're taking this out of the RFC. This is the RFC example for what a URI is. And it says basically that the URI has several components. The schema, which to us is not as important in this class because it's going to be HTTP or HTTPS. The authority, which, believe it or not, in this class may or may not be as important just because we're probably going to be able to discover this pretty quickly. Now, what is important is the path, the query, and sometimes the fragment. But the path and the query is important. The path ends up being the resource that we're after, right? And this could be the part that we are actually brute forcing and trying to discover whether or not we can find additional resources out of, or the query, which is where we may want to find business logic that is left exposed. Okay. Now, these things are fairly sometimes misunderstood. Just understand that in this example for the URI, where we're going to care about taking and iterating through these things. That's really the big thing about that. So if I want to build my way into this, how can I do it? Well, we are going to introduce you in class to something called Common Speak 2. Common Speak 2 is it's actually a very nice Go-based application. It's a very simple script, really, that takes the logic of the Google BigQuery and allows us to make word lists out of it. So what is Google BigQuery? So Google BigQuery is it's based on Google Bigtable, which is how they store and database things. And BigQuery is a service that lets you actually use queries against publicly large data sets. There are a ton of these things out there. And actually, I give you a link to a Reddit wiki, the BigQuery Bigtable Reddit wiki, which actually shows you all of the different data sources and data elements that Google will allow you to query for. What Common Speak 2 did, by the way, and this is actually a research project from a asset and infrastructure company called AssetNote. They're out of Australia, and what they do is they do large-scale, wide internet assessments. It's kind of a new and emerging area out there. If you haven't seen it, there's a ton of these out there. We talk about them at length on the first day of class. But Common Speak is this project which takes queries out of specific technology verticals and allows you to create massive word lists that we can use to discover things like APIs and all of these undocumented things so that we can map out the functionality of an application quickly, right? That's the idea. Here's an example of what it looks like. So for example, I had to actually fix some of the queries, and I've actually committed the code back to the folks there because there was some issues with the SQL statements that were being run lately. The tool hasn't been updated in about a year, so there may be some manual massaging that you have to do. So I actually did the manual massaging and sent it back up to them to see if they'll accept it. But basically what you will do is you will select some objects, and in this example here, we are selecting URLs from Hacker News. So if you think about the way that Hacker News works, Hacker News is a forum in which the people over at Y Combinator run, and it just talks about startups and all the things that startup developers and programmers talk about. And they take this entire repository of Hacker News data and they store it in Bigtable, and they give it to you as a publicly queryable data set. So what the CommonsPeak engine will do is it will take that list of objects, right, of those forum posts and everything, and it will find all of the URLs that are in there, right? So maybe there's a list of URLs for all of these different blog repositories, or there'll be URLs for like projects alike. And then we could take that list of URLs for years, and we can actually say, okay, I want you to give me all the URLs, uniquely, and I want you to give me the subdomain. In other words, the first character of it. And I want you to output that as a word list. So what do you get? www, you get that, you get M, you get blog, you get API, you get et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2 million of these things. Well, now you have a word list of 2 million objects that you can actually throw at your target and try to enumerate hidden servers. And then there's one for resources, so files that end in ASP, files that end in RB for Ruby, PHP, etc. And so now you're finding an undocumented set of resources, or maybe helping map out the application at scale, so that you can actually see the common patterns in the application, and now you can start to reveal the infrastructure, right? And you would use this, maybe not in an internal application environment or infrastructure, but you could use this at scale where you may find 2 million hosts somewhere in a cloud service provider network that you're looking at and targeting. All right, that is the idea behind the CommonsPeak command. So here's an example of what CommonsPeak provides. So for example, there's a whole section on routes. So if you've ever developed an application and the application has a routing pattern, so /API, /index, /login, /register, /pay, it actually will create a list of routes based on Ruby on Rails for you to do that with, right? Or deleted files. So it'll go to GitHub and it'll find every file that's ever been deleted from a repository, and it'll print that out as a word list. Because maybe you find that developers are committing specific files to their repositories that are sensitive and then trying to back those out. Well, if you find those, that could be interesting, right? And so we could build these really massive, well-tuned, well-defined word lists of technologies or files or routes or whatever, to be able to throw that up against a cloud service provider or a platform or an application that we have the agreement that we could test in order to see if they've actually done any one of those errors, if they have any one of those issues or committed any one of those crimes. And we can do this in a rather efficient manner that allows us to scale out the requests. So I included some of these, and I've given, because the project sometimes gets a little bit difficult to deal with if you haven't done this before. I put in here an example of how to actually query Bigtable. So you have to have a Google Cloud Cloud environment key. So I actually have one. You have to give it a domain, and then you actually have to run it against some kind of a BigQuery engine. And so here's an example of how you can output subdomains or files that end in JSP or Java servlet pages, which would be files on a server, that kind of thing. And that's it. Yeah. So that's an example. And by the way, the lab that follows this area, we actually give you a we actually show you how to hunt in the cloud environment and discover some hidden services and some hidden APIs that may or may not lead you down the path to finding more and more servers and getting higher and higher privileges in our class, just so that you can start to go through and exploit things and the like. So it's actually a fun way of running through the course, and just spending some time on doing the things that you may not be comfortable with doing or having no experience doing, like building very large million and million line word lists and utilizing them and being able to do this in an efficient manner, right? So hopefully this kind of gives you a taste for where we're going, right? And how the class is going. And so I do want to leave you for one more thing before we break out for questions. And this is going to date me and my boomer references and all that. It's going to date me for a minute, right? So there was an episode of The Simpsons. And if you don't know what The Simpsons are, it was a 1990s, 2000s. I know they still have them today. Cartoon that mommies and daddies watch. Okay, so if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. But there was an episode of it where they were trying to get people to join the Navy. And by the way, the episode is about the New Kids on the Block, just to date you, give you how old it is. And it was to join the Navy, all right? And in the episode, they said they had 3 ways of getting people to enlist in the Navy. It was subliminal, which meant they were putting subliminal messages into things. Liminal, which was, basically just talking about it. And then there was superliminal, where they would yell out the window and say, "Join the Navy." And in that scene right there, Carl and I forgot the other guy's name. They just like, all right, I guess we should join the Navy. So I'm not asking to join the Navy. If you have, well, thank you for your service. But we are looking for instructors, and so SANS is always looking for instructors. If you don't know that, and for this class, I was talking to Steve Sims, who runs the pen test curriculum, and he was like, you need some additional people to help you run the class, because this class is fairly important to the industry. I mean, there's a lot of people that are asking for a cloud penetration testing class because it is filling a gap. And I'll be honest with you, it's a very strange niche that is being filled here. So if you have experience doing this and you have an interest, what I will ask is that you just reach out to me. Or if you have any feedback for this class, I will ask that you just reach out to me. I'm pretty easygoing when it comes to that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's all the slides that I have for today. So I will leave this up here in case somebody does want to reach me, and I will open it up for questions.
All right, thanks for that great presentation. We do have quite a few questions, so I'll jump in and get started. Here's the first one. What overlap does this class have with SEC560 and SEC542? And what class is either a required prerequisite or recommended before SEC588?
Oh, yeah, so it's funny, Carol, I only got 2 questions out to me. I actually don't have a questions window, so I never saw the questions. But I think we went over the overlap, right? It's very, very minimal overlap in terms of the tools. I mean, we don't for 560, by the way, just to be clear, in this class, like we don't talk about things like we don't talk about like Mimikatz. We don't get into that. We don't do like Metasploit. We don't do W3AF. We don't do burp. We don't do zap, any of that stuff. Now, prerequisite class, I've written this class in mind where you do not need to have much knowledge about either the infrastructure environments or even pen testing in general. I try to get you through a lot of the components of it. If you do have experience in that, great, it's only going to help, but there's no requirement that you take a class, a prerequisite class before or anything. We do, however, and I will put this out there, we do, however, very heavily use command line tools like Linux. So having that little bit of Linux understanding of the command line will be helpful, but we do spell out exactly what command you're typing and the like. So it's a great question, by the way.
All right, and sorry, Moses, for not continuing to put these in the questions window. I did put them in now, but I'll read them to you. And you may have covered some of this as you went along. Will the course cover not just how to abuse, penetrate cloud providers' APIs, but also how to secure them?
Yes, we do talk about, and this was a request that I had prior to the class, we do talk about what the right way of doing things are as well, because, if you're sitting here and you're doing any kind of testing, typically what happens is after the test, they want you to answer, well, how do I fix it? And so we try to help guide and provide some best practices. Not every situation is covered, but we try to help provide some best practices as we go along.
All right, thanks. Someone asks, when's the release or launch date or / event? And what's the certification? And is there a coin?
Is there a coin? Yes. Is there a certification? That's not up to me. You know, that's a GIAC question. So I can't answer that. When is the targeted beginning? We're targeting a February date for a beta run of the class. So that is the current target.
All right, thanks. So this class will focus on pen testing, AWS, Azure, and GCP.
AWS and Azure are the infrastructure pieces that we're doing. Google Cloud, we do not focus on Google Cloud, and there wasn't a bias one way or the other. The idea there, and I'll just give it out to, because other people may have the question, I'll just put it out there. My bias was to just have one, right? And right now by market share, it looks like Amazon's the biggest just because they've been around the longest. However, there are certain things about Azure that are fairly unique, and I do see a lot of enterprises moving to Azure. So while I have nothing against Google Cloud, because I actually use Google Cloud for a fair number of my things, I had to pick one or two. I couldn't cover them all. So that was just something, it's kind of a rough one to choose from. So, but it's a good point.
All right, thanks. Is there any actual testing against AWS or Azure given their permission requirements?
There is testing against AWS and Azure, and it does not violate their terms of service. We had to spend a lot of time looking through the terms of service for both of those providers and to make sure that we did not actually violate any of the terms of service. Now, we never ever attack actual infrastructure because that does violate their terms of service.
All right, thanks. Will the class address securing third-party CI or CD pipelines?
We talk about CI/CD with Jenkins X, and we talk about proper key management. We do a little bit on libraries, but not much. We don't have a lab on libraries. We talk about how you would secure the supply chain itself with different commercial products.
All right, thanks. Do you dedicate any time in your course towards the role of or vulnerabilities in cloud access security brokers?
We don't have CASBs. I gotta think. I don't think we wrote a module on CASBs. We definitely don't have a lab on CASBs. But a CASB could be used, of course, to provide data for any one of the things that we're talking about.
All right, thanks. Just two more. Does the class teach you how to prevent scope creep in a cloud architecture environment when performing a pen test?
Ooh, that is a great one. So we don't focus on the mechanics of running a penetration test, and mostly we spend a lot of time on demarcation and where the lines are drawn between the terms of service. And the reason we don't talk about scope too much is because scope is heavily covered in 560, and we didn't want to introduce too much overlap between the reporting and the like.
All right, and the last one is, will there be an exam associated with this class?
It's a GIAC question. I do not know. I would expect that there would be, but I have no control of that. That is totally up to GIAC and how they want to do classes, and I mean certifications.
All right, well, we asked all the questions right at the time when the presentation has ended. So thank you so much, Moses, for your great presentation, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.